Here to be with all of you today to talk with you about our project, which began in 2019. As Aaron mentioned, it's a project, a 6-year project funded by USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or NIFA. And the title, as you can see, is Thriving Agricultural Systems in Urbanized Landscapes, or Thriving Ag for short. And Thriving Ag then is a collaborative effort of several institutions. You can see most of the logos here at the bottom. Penn State University is the lead on the project. Then also the University of Maryland and the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, or UMSCES, Ohio State University, Virginia Tech, the Stroudwater Research Center, which some of you may know, some may not, is located in southeastern Pennsylvania, Utah State University. They are our external evaluator then on the Thriving Ag project. And then finally, and last but not least, George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So next slide, please, Parmveer. So the Thriving Ag project then is focused on agriculture along the rural-urban continuum, exurban and suburban agriculture. And we can see here in this slide a picture then from Montgomery County in Pennsylvania, which is in the southeast part of the state, fairly close to Philadelphia. And you can see then in the background, behind the farm fields then, both the farm itself and a housing development. And this is the kind of agriculture then that is typical then in these environments, where agriculture is interspersed with housing, office facilities, industrial locations, and other non-agricultural and urban land uses. And exurban and suburban agriculture is important. It's important for a variety of reasons. First of all, it constitutes the economic base then of many counties. Even those with substantial non-agricultural industries then still often depend on agriculture and on food processing. One of the common sayings, particularly by the Secretary of Agriculture in Pennsylvania, is that agriculture is Pennsylvania's #1 industry. And that would include everything, from farm to fork, as well as agricultural input supply companies. And I'm sure that, many other states that are in the same situation. And many of the counties then in Pennsylvania and in other parts then of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and indeed throughout the United States then, have an economic base that depends heavily on agriculture and food processing. Many people enjoy, another reason to value exurban and suburban agriculture is because of locally produced food. And so that would include then not only farmers markets, but of course all the locally produced food that is bought by grocery store chains in that same vicinity then, and put on there for us to purchase then when we visit the grocery store. Exurban and suburban agriculture is often important as well then for open space and scenery amenities. People enjoy looking at farm fields, farm animals, the rolling terrain. Those are things that are important to people, and they place a value on that. And exurban and suburban agriculture then also offers opportunities for agritourism and other recreation activities. Opportunities to visit farms and to actually see what a farm is like, what takes place on a farm. And then, of course, many farms then have pick-your-own operations, or will have stores then on the farms themselves to sell products to consumers. And then another reason to value this type of agriculture then is that it's a source of habitat then for many forms of wildlife. Okay, next slide, please, Parmveer. Just to put a bit of a quantitative view then on the importance then of exurban and suburban agriculture. This slide right here draws upon some data then from the 2017 Census of Agriculture, as well as then some rural-urban continuum codes that are prepared every 10 years by USDA's Economic Research Service. And those rural-urban continuum codes then divide the counties in the United States into 9 different categories. And here we have those counties then aggregated into 4 groups. And so we've got metropolitan counties with a population of 1 million or more. And in 2017, they accounted for 6% of net farm income. So this would be truly urban agriculture. These are counties then with large urban populations, and that 6% then would represent urban agriculture. It's the next two categories in blue there, the darker blue and then the lighter blue, that are really the sweet spot then for the Thriving Ag Project. Other metropolitan counties then that don't have 1 million people or more, but are still metropolitan in nature, accounting for about 1/5 then of net farm income in 2017. And then also non-metropolitan counties that are adjacent to a metropolitan county, and therefore a source then of markets then for products produced in the non-metropolitan counties, as well as workers then who might work in either or both counties. And they account for over 1/3 then of net farm income then in 2017. And the darker green then to the left, the non-metropolitan counties, which are not adjacent to a metro county, those would be the rural counties. And they account then for over 1/3 then of US farm income in total as well. But the two blue parts of the pie then are over 1/2 at about 56%. And so this type of agriculture from an economic perspective then certainly matters. Next slide, please, Farm Bureau. Here's another view on that. And so this again is drawing on data then from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. And then also these rural urban continuum codes prepared by USDA's Economic Research Service. And this slide is showing us a couple of things, this county map of the United States. First of all, we have the metropolitan counties and then the non-metropolitan counties, which are adjacent to a metro county, and those then are in different shades of green. And then we have the rural counties, which are in different shades of blue. And so you can see then where the metro and metro adjacent counties then are located. With many then, of course, along the eastern and western seaboards of the United States, as well as urban areas throughout most states of the country. And the shades of blue and shades of green then are indicating then different categories of net farm income per acre. And I think one point that I wanted to draw out there then was that the value then of farm income per acre in many then of these metro and metro adjacent counties is quite high, $1,000 or more. That's significant and represents another illustration then of the importance then of urban, exurban, and suburban agriculture then to the U.S. farm sector. Next slide, please, Farm Bureau. So what are some of the differences then between rural agriculture and urbanizing agriculture? And this slide is just a nice illustration then of some of those differences. And so rural agriculture then tends to produce products that really could be shipped and consumed in any part of the world. And so national and global market forces then are very important to rural agriculture, as are the means then to connect then to those national and global markets. And so access to national and global supply chains then is very important for rural agriculture. And in rural agriculture then, the kinds of policies and regulations that matter most tend to be those at the federal level and the state level. So farm bill policies, state agricultural policies, those would be the kinds of things that matter a great deal then to rural agriculture. And all of those things are at play then to some extent in urbanized agriculture, but there's many other things then that also are important then to agriculture and urbanizing landscapes. First then would be local and state policy and policies and regulations, particularly regulations taking place at the municipal level, at the township level, however local governments are organized in various states, at the county level. Those kinds of policies and regulations then can impact agriculture and are important then to where agriculture is located and how agricultural operations are carried out. And in contrast then to rural agriculture, which is focusing primarily on national and global market forces, in urbanizing agriculture, local and regional market forces can be very important, since the products tend to be consumed then within a relatively short distance then of where they're produced. If you take a look, for example, at much of the products that are produced then within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, livestock products such as dairy and poultry, for example, that tends to be consumed within the Bay watershed itself, or right outside of it then in cities like Philadelphia and New York City. One advantage that urbanized agriculture has then is access then to improved agriculture. So a denser network of highways and other transportation systems that provides it benefit. On the other hand, urbanizing agriculture faces pressure, significant pressure then from land use changes. And so that would include, of course, housing developments, industrial developments, and then more recently, things such as utility scale solar then that are placing pressure then on agricultural land. And coming back to the policy angle, so state policies, local and regional policies on watersheds and other environmental matters then can be very important to urbanizing agriculture, as can be local zoning and farmland preservation programs. Okay, Parmveer, the next slide, please. There are a number of challenges then to the sustainability of agriculture then in these urbanizing landscapes. On the economic side, I think we're thinking here then about farm profitability, the continued existence of farming then in these environments. And in that regard, then competition for land, competition for water and workers then would be at the top of the list in terms of challenges then that agriculture faces in terms of economic sustainability. Having the ability then to serve local markets, having the infrastructure in place, having the capability in place, for example, to run an on-farm store if a farm wishes to do that. Environmental regulations can create challenges. They can increase costs then of agricultural operations, and that then can impact profitability. As can local regulations that restrict farm operations. For example, the hours of the day then that farm machinery can be out on roads, or whatever it might be. Those types of regulations then that impose restrictions on farm operations. On the environmental side, water quality can be a significant concern. For example, nitrogen, excess nitrogen and excess phosphorus then from crop and livestock operations. That's certainly a very important issue then in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. In many parts of the country, water quantity is a concern. Generally not in most years in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where there's typically sufficient rainfall then in order for agriculture to operate. But of course, in many other parts of the country, particularly the West, that isn't the case. Greenhouse gas emissions, kind of an issue everywhere. Greenhouse gas emissions from crop operations, from livestock operations, and the challenges that places, and then to the environmental sustainability of agriculture, both within these urbanizing landscapes themselves and globally. And then we can't forget about agricultural pests and odors and dusts. With respect to odors, for example, certain types of farm operations, particularly those involving livestock, such as pigs and hogs, then can give off odors then that create issues for people then who live near those farms. So these are some of the sustainability challenges then that agriculture and urbanizing landscapes faces. Okay, Parmveer, next slide, please. Well, the Thriving Ag Project, as Aaron said then at the outset of the webinar, it's a 6-year project. It started then in 2019 and will finish up next year in 2025. It was originally a 5-year project, but we received a 1-year no-cost extension then from NIFA. The project then just got going really in 2019 to 2020, just as COVID was getting going. And of course, we know all the challenges then that COVID created, and our project was not an exception to that. It's a $9 million project, again, funded by NIFA. And in particular, then the Sustainable Agricultural Systems, or SAS program then in NIFA, which offers funding then of up to $10 million for projects that are directed at improving the sustainability of agriculture. And on this slide too, a shot from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Lancaster County actually is responsible for about 1/5 then of all the agricultural output then in Pennsylvania. So it's very important to Pennsylvania agriculture. And you can see then on one side of the road, then we have a housing development. And further back then on the other side of the road, we have an agricultural operation. Okay, next slide, please, Barnbeer. The project partner institutions, I mentioned them earlier, but again, Penn State, the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, or UMSES, Ohio State, the Stroud Water Research Center, Utah State, Virginia Tech, and George Washington University. Okay, the next slide, please, Barnbeer. So the vision really of the Thriving Ag Project, where we would like to get to, is a sustainable and environmentally viable agriculture, which we view then as essential then for the future of our environment and the future of our quality of life. And in particular then, we think that a support then for functional and healthy ecosystems is necessary for this future, as are profitable farms. Profitable farms then really are the kinds of farms, and really the only kinds of farms, that can become sustainable then in an environmental sense. Because if a farm is losing money, there will not be resources available then, in most cases then, to fund those kinds of environmental improvements on the farm. Okay. Next slides, please, Barnbeer. The goal of the Thriving Ag Project then is to achieve an environmentally and economically sustainable agriculture in urbanized landscapes over the next 25 years. And we're conducting then, as part of that, a research, outreach, engagement, and education then in order to reach this goal. And as Aaron mentioned then at the start of the webinar here today, the Chesapeake Bay watershed then is serving as a case study and proof of concept then for the ideas, technologies, and recommendations then coming out of this project. The project then involves close engagement and co-learning with stakeholders. And I didn't put the term transdisciplinary on that slide, but that is the approach that we're taking very much, is a transdisciplinary approach. Then bringing together then scientists from a number of different disciplines, as well as stakeholders to engage in co-learning and closely involving then the stakeholders in the development of the project. We're taking a scenario-based approach, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes. And we're doing all of that then at multiple scales. At the scale of farm fields, at the scale of farms, at landscape scales, at watershed scales, and also then, for some parts of the project then, going up to the national and world scales. Because again, even though local and regional markets are quite important to urbanizing agriculture, national and global markets can also play a role. And we are seeking then and are developing new technologies, management strategies, and policy tools in order to address then these sustainability challenges. Okay, Barnbeer, next slide, please. This is a large project. We divided the project then into 16 task teams. And I don't think the 16th one is showing there at the bottom, but let me just run through them very quickly. So task teams 1 and 2 then are focusing on our stakeholder advisory board, which is a group then of about 20 or so professionals then, again, we are working with closely. And then 3 and 4 then focus on networks of engaged stakeholders. In other words, stakeholders then throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed then, who we have engaged with then in this project through a series of workshops, as well as project newsletters and social media and other things. Task Team 5 focuses on market analysis for local and organic products. 6 on blockchain technology to expand markets for value-added products. 7 and 12 then on adaptive management sites, sites that are where the management then of nutrients on those sites is responsive to site-specific conditions, and then field-scale nutrient management tools. And then taking that up then in terms of a level of spatial aggregation to the watershed level, and that is Task Team 8. Task Team 9 then is focusing on collaboration then for effective agricultural technical assistance. And then coming back to nutrient management and taking it up even one more scale than spatially, task team 10 then regional scale nutrient management tools. Task team 11 is focusing on land use modeling, addressing those land use conversion issues, which are so important then to these environments. 13 then economic simulations and modeling, taking a look at national and global market forces, as well as policies then implemented at various levels and their impacts then on agriculture in urbanizing landscapes. 14 and 15 then cover our education and extension plans. And then task team 16 then, which is led by Utah State, our external evaluator then, is the external project evaluation. Okay, Parmveer. Next slide, please. So here's a bit more then about the co-learning process and how we've approached that. And so, we've relied upon the stakeholder advisory board then to frame the issues, to help us frame the issues, to evaluate various options. And we worked then closely with them to build a series of 5 scenarios that I'll talk about in just a minute for reaching then the goals then of the Thriving Ag Project, and that give us then a stakeholder vision then for the future of agriculture in these landscapes. And then after that, we've got the research team conducting experiments, testing, modeling, analyses to produce research-based solutions then for achieving the vision identified then in the first step. And then bring those, excuse me, Parmveer. Yeah, thank you. And then we bring those solutions then that are proposed by the research team back to the stakeholders in order to refine them or to reevaluate the stakeholder vision and conduct further research. Ultimately leading then to various outputs and outcomes, which would be the research-based changes then to policies and practices, technology solutions, education and extension plans, improved models, guidelines, and decision support tools. Okay, now we can go to the next slide, Parmveer. So let's talk about the scenario approach for just a minute. So a scenario, of course, is just, what is a scenario? It's just a plausible story about the future. And in our case, then, the future of agriculture in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in that it would include then the key drivers of change within the watershed. And our approach then, again, involved close stakeholder involvement then in developing the scenarios and interpreting then the scenario outcomes. And the scenario storylines then are ones that we've incorporated then into the project models then in order to explore then the outcomes from these scenarios. Next slide, please, Parmveer. So as I mentioned, then we developed 5 scenarios. The first was a business as usual scenario. This then is our scenario against which we can compare everything else. And so this would be one then where existing trends continue over the next 25 years as they have then in recent years, trends in urbanization and agriculture, food consumption, and climate change. So that then is our point of comparison, the business as usual scenario. And then the second one, ecosystem services. And in this scenario then, we envision a situation where farms are incentivized to implement and to maintain then various agricultural best management practices by receiving payments for how well the BMPs actually perform. So in other words, that's a difference then from the way that best management practices then are typically financed and, and the programs for best management practices, which typically pay farmers then for installation of the practices, but not for performance. Next slide, please, Parmveer. The third scenario then involves farmland preservation. So a significant expansion then by state and local governments then in so-called smart growth policies involving farmland preservation, zoning, and urban growth boundaries to deal with the kinds of pressures then on land conversion that exist in urbanizing landscapes. The fourth scenario then is local food. And in this scenario then, local consumers then embrace the agricultural community and food systems become more localized than they are now, which allows then farms to produce more specialty crops and more value-added products then to sell then in local markets. And next, please, Barn Beer. And then finally, and this was the one scenario that our stakeholder advisory board, for the most part, was, or at least some of the folks on the stakeholder advisory board were somewhat skeptical about, but we thought it was an important one to include. And that's one involving plant-based proteins and alternative meats. And so this is one then involving a disruptive dietary shift then to these plant-based proteins and alternative meats, in the same way then that cow's milk alternatives have become popular with many consumers. And I think, depending upon the estimates that you look at, I think, anywhere from 15 to 20% then kind of cow's milk and its alternatives, if you add all them together. Right now, I think about 15 to 20% of that market then is captured by almond milk, soy milk, and all the various other alternatives then to cow's milk. And so this scenario is like that one, but in the case of meat. Okay, next slide, please, Farm Beer. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Chesapeake Bay watershed. For those of you then who don't work in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, it's the largest estuary in the United States, encompassing 6 states then, as well as the District of Columbia. The 6 states then being Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. And it's home then to over 18 million people. It includes then the major metropolitan areas of Washington, D.C., Baltimore, as well as a number of other metro areas, such as Richmond, Virginia, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And about 1/3 then of the land then in the Chesapeake Bay watershed is in agriculture. Most of the land in the watershed is in forests, but about 1/3 is in agriculture. And there are over 75,000 farms then in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And agriculture in the watershed then is heavily focused on livestock. So over 2/3 then of agricultural sales then from farms in the Chesapeake Bay watershed are from livestock products, and particularly then poultry and dairy. And so poultry, for example, along the Delmarva Peninsula and in southeastern Pennsylvania, dairy in southeastern Pennsylvania, as well as other places, and a variety of other than livestock products as well. And then most then of the crops then, the row crops that are produced in Pennsylvania, corn and soybeans, of course, primarily then, are used then as feed either on the farm or on other local farms by the livestock on those farms. Okay, Farm Beer, next slide, please. One of the pieces of research that we did as part of this project was a cluster analysis of counties in the United States. And that involves just then categorizing those clusters then by different characteristics. Because we wanted to see, to what extent then are farms in the Chesapeake Bay watershed like those in other parts of the country, and to what extent are they different? And we found then 2 major types of farms then in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The first then are small, labor-intensive, and high-value farms. So these are farms then that are located on land that is worth a lot. And the building assets then on them are worth a great deal as well. These are farms that don't have a lot of machinery, but produce labor-intensive crops such as vegetables and fruits. They tend to employ a large number of agricultural workers, many of them seasonal in nature. For example, in apples, the apple production. And they tend to be small farms. And then the next slide then, Farm Beer, please. And the second type then were small and low resource farms. And these then one can find throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as in many other parts of the United States, as you can see then from the red dots throughout the country. These are farms that tend to have low land and building asset values, relatively little in terms of machinery assets, not a whole lot of agricultural workers and small acreages. However, they do make high use then of fertilizer and agricultural chemicals. So these are small, low resource farms then that one finds in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as many other parts of the US. Okay, Farm Beer, the next slide, please. One of the key concerns, and I would say probably the key concern then when it comes to the environment then, and agriculture in the Chesapeake Bay watershed then is concerns about water quality, and in particular then about excess nitrogen and excess phosphorus, as well as, of course, sediment. This then, this slide here presents some results then from one of the studies, part of the research that was financed by the Thriving Ag Project. And this is looking at nitrogen losses at the county level within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And the chart then, the figure on the right part then of this slide here shows all of the losses then at the county level as a whole. And you can see then significant nitrogen losses then occurring, for example, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which again is home to 1/5 of Pennsylvania's agriculture and has major poultry and dairy industries in it. Along the eastern shore, the Delmarva Peninsula, for example, in Sussex County in Delaware, where the poultry industry along the Delmarva Peninsula is significant. Two other places that are highlighted are Franklin, Pennsylvania, Franklin County then being the home to many dairy operations, and then Rockingham County in Virginia, home again to a variety then of livestock, significant livestock production, particularly turkeys in the case of Rockingham County. And the left-hand side of the slide then breaks out the nitrogen losses then to different stages of the food and agricultural value chain. So starting with LN1, for example, nitrogen inputs that aren't taken up by crops, to LN3, for example, which would be feed waste and manure loss, and then other stages then of the value chains that are illustrated here. And this is work, as you can see there at the bottom, that was conducted research by Panis Mohammadpour and Caitlin Grady then as part of the Thriving Ag Project. Okay, Parmveer, next slide, please. I'd like to spend a few minutes then talking about some of the outputs and findings from the Thriving Ag Project, in addition to the ones that have already been mentioned. And as Aaron then and Parmveer were mentioning, I think at the beginning of this webinar, on the Extension Foundation webpage then for the Thriving Ag Project, and you can see the link right there, there's a series of project fact sheets then with more information then about the project. And I'll be drawing then in the rest of my presentation then on some of those fact sheets. And then if you'd like to learn more, the Thriving Ag Project has a website, thrivingag.org. And if you'd really like to take a deep dive, we have all of our annual reports, and our evaluation team has prepared a series of reports, and they're all on the website then under the project overview page. Okay, next slide, please, Parmveer. Okay, and I've organized then the things that I'll talk about here during the remainder then around our 5 scenarios, and most of them will be around then the ecosystem services scenario. And so one of the things that this project helped develop in work that was led then by Charlie White and other members of our project team is the project contributed then to the development then of a new nitrogen decision-making tool, which allows a user then to input site-specific soil and cover crop data. And using that data, as well as other information within the tool itself, we'll calculate a recommendation then for nitrogen fertilizer for corn that accounts for nitrogen availability from soil organic matter and cover crop residues. And the tool itself is described in greater detail then in one of our project fact sheets. And then you can see then the link then to the Penn State Extension website, which includes more information about that as well. Okay, the next slide, please, Parmveer. In terms of cover crops then, research then that was conducted or has been conducted then on the use of cover crops to reduce nitrogen leaching. And in the Thriving Ag Project then, this research then is taking place at Penn State, at the University of Maryland, and at Virginia Tech. And this particular slide then is focused then on some of the research at Penn State and the project's role then in helping to finance 10 years of research in Center County, Pennsylvania. And of course, for long-term research of this kind, you know, like 10 years, it's very tough to find a project that's going to provide funding for 10 years. And so, you know, it's very important then to have one project which can get this kind of research launched And then in this case right here, another project like Thriving Ag then that can pick up where the other project left off to continue this important field research. And the key thing that we found here that was that cover crops then significantly reduce potential nitrogen leaching. And you can see particularly then species of cover crops that are in the grass and mustard families. And this work then was led by Jason Kay, as well as other project team members that are listed here on this slide. And, next slide, please, Barbara. Yeah. And then in some work that was led by Sivan Raj and Murali Kalra, some work then using the soil and water assessment tool, the SWAT model, to simulate an expansion then of cover crops in the Susquehanna River Basin. The Susquehanna River Basin is the largest sub-watershed then in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And cover crops then currently account for about 20% of row crop acreages. And the simulation here then involved expanding that to 40%. And based upon the model results then, there was a net reduction then in average annual sediment load of about 8% then from the Susquehanna River Basin to the Chesapeake Bay, as well as reductions then in deliveries to the Chesapeake Bay of nitrogen, about 3%, and then phosphorus, about 6%. Okay, next slide, please, Parmveer. And then finally here then in terms of ecosystem services, some other research taken as part of the project then by project team members Lisa Wanger and Dan Reed on things that, and finding out what actually works then in increasing conservation practice adoption. And one interesting thing that they found was that pictures of installed practices can increase farmer interest then in those practices. But they're rarely used, surprisingly, by technical assistance providers. And I guess the first time that I heard Lisa and Dan talking about that result, of course, my mind went immediately to the old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And here in the case of riparian forest buffers, for example, you can see at the lower left then two before and after pictures then of a riparian forest buffer, and then versus something then which was shown then in an experiment to others then which didn't involve pictures and which elicited less interest than the one involving pictures. And they also found then that financial incentives then tend to be more consistently effective then for promoting practice adoption than other approaches. Okay, next slide, please, Parmveer. And I'll share just one other finding then from the project here today, and that is in the local foods and the task team in that area. And that's Ted Janicki and others then who are part of that task team. And they find then that consumers are sometimes willing to pay a premium for local food products, but in awful cases not. Consumers in rural and agricultural regions tend to be willing to pay the most, while those then in more urban environments are generally willing to pay less. And so here then, we have a picture then of various census tracts then in Pennsylvania. And there are some census tracts that are shaded in blue. Those are the areas that are willing to pay more. For example, in southeastern Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, the one in darker blue down there, is willing to pay more than for locally produced potato chips than for non-local ones. On the other hand, the counties shaded in red are willing to pay less. And so you can look, for example, at Philadelphia County in the eastern part of the state, the bright red there, and then the bright red in the western part of the state, that would be Pittsburgh, where consumers are willing to pay significantly less for local potato chips than for non-local ones. Okay, Parmveer, next slide, please. So I hope that provides then you with a little bit of information then about the project itself, the kinds of things that we are doing in the project, and some of the findings that we've obtained. And again, there's more information then in those fact sheets then on the Extension Foundation webpage for the project and in the project website itself, thrivingag.org. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Abler and Parmveer, for this presentation. We do have some time left, so I wanted to see if any of our participants had any questions that they would like to ask. Feel free to put that in the chat, or if you would like to open up your mic and ask the question, feel free to do that as well. And I'll just give it a moment in case anybody's typing.
Hi, I'll jump in here. My name's Andrea Ludwig, and I'm a faculty member here at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And we are endeavoring on an urban agriculture grant year one. And I'm curious, we're trying to integrate in some workshops through Extension and directly utilizing some soil samples that we'll get from our participants into kind of our research questions. And I'm wondering if y'all have any insights into any sort of similar experiences working directly with farmers and producers, gathering data from their operations and then integrating it into your outputs.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that question. Yeah, at Penn State, as well as then at the University of Maryland, then and Virginia Tech. In all three institutions, then we have faculty then who have extension appointments and active extension programs then who are part of the project. And so, we've relied upon them in the Thriving Ag Project, and their connections then with their state extension services, county agents, and so on and so forth. Then, and the events then that all of those extension services then carry out every single year. The kinds of field days and crop days that they typically have, and have taken advantage then of their connections and knowledge that they have then in the extension services in these agencies. So it was getting the right people on the project team, and then providing them with the funds that they need in order to do their research, as well as then the funds that they need then in order to disseminate that research and to engage with farmers, through these kinds of means.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea, for the question. Leslie, I see that you opened up your microphone. Do you have a question?
I do have a couple of questions and a couple of thoughts. Thank you, Dr. Abler, for your presentation. So I'm with the USDA's Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production. I did not get a chance to hear the very beginning of your presentation, so I'm sorry if my question has already been covered. But when you all did your research, did you take into account any of the producers that are actually in urban areas? And have you all given any thought to how to bridge the gap between those urban producers and the folks that are right at that peri-urban, suburban interface, and whether there's some additional opportunities for direct marketing through some of their farmers markets and things like that? And the reason why I asked that question is because at the very end of your presentation, you mentioned that some of the consumers in places like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, may not be willing to pay a higher premium for local value-added products. I guess my question is, do they really see those products as local to them? Maybe part of the reason why they would not pay the higher premium. But just generally, how are you all looking at some of these new urban producers, and how are you looking to bridge that gap, since this area is urbanizing even more, as you say?
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Those are good questions. And so our project then is focused primarily then on the rural-urban continuum. So the producers then who are in the exurban and suburban counties, and so we focused on that then, and then not so much in this project itself then on the producers in urban areas. Although you raised some excellent points there, for the producers then who are in urban areas, then being able to get their products, for example, to farmers markets, and the challenges that are involved in that, and I'm involved in another grant proposal. It's still in the proposal stage, but it's an attempt to look at that very issue because that is an important one. And what it takes then to get those farmers access then to those farmers markets and allow them to successfully sell there. I think your third question there, your point then about consumers then in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh then perhaps not seeing those products as local to them. That's a very good point. The term local itself is always a fuzzy one, and there are different definitions of it. So in this case right here, Ted Janicki and his team then looked at where the products were being sold. And if a lot of sales then were coming then from a particular state, then it was determined that, as far as that criterion was concerned, that it was a Pennsylvania product. And so, the distinction then between local and non-local then was made at the state level. And so that leaves open then the possibility then, that within a state then people in one place may see the products as local, but those in another part of the state where the product isn't manufactured or grown may not see it as local. And I think that's a really good point. And in many cases, then it can be difficult for a consumer to know, unless it's really highlighted in a grocery store or in some other place than where consumers are shopping. I guess we would all suspect and know that whatever's being sold at a farmer's market is local, but in a grocery store, it may not be clear at all. And that actually was one of the points then of some of the research that I didn't get a chance to talk about here today, but that was the blockchain part of the research, which is then going to the farms themselves and registering within a blockchain, where and when that product was produced, and then tracing the product then from the farm to the point then where it's sold then to the end consumer. So that grocery stores, for example, that are selling product, could go back to the farm itself and say, this product came from this particular farm. And the consumers then would be able to know and hopefully trust in that information and believe that, yeah, this is a local product. But that's a very good point that you have there. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. I see we have a question in the chat. Before I get to that, I just wanted to see if anybody else wanted to open their mic up and ask a question. Okay, the question in the chat, another question from Andrea here. Any suggestions on how to recruit producers to participate in programs? The urban ag community seems more nebulous than the conventional ag community. So any insights on how to reach them?
I think the closest counterpart that we would have to that, I think, in the Thriving Ag Project then would be in the agricultural technical assistance and the conservation programs then that are part of that, and the best management practices that contribute to that. And I think there were the two findings then that I mentioned in my presentation. The first on the value of a picture, being worth 1,000 words, and even a picture, of course, is very low tech now, and there may be other ways to engage through videos on social media or whatever it might be. Things where producers can be shown kind of an image then, or a video then of what things could be like if they participated in these programs. Other successful operations, what they look like. That would be one possibility. And the other main finding then that we found as far as the adoption then of best management practices was the importance then of financial incentives. And money is not the be all and the end all by any means, but making sure that the financial incentives then are commensurate then with what's being asked then of producers. What are you asking them to do? What are you expecting them to do? And making sure that the financial incentive lines up with that.
Thank you so much. Any other questions from our participants? Feel free to open up your mic or put them in the chat. Okay, hearing none right now. Just want to thank you both, Dr. Abler and Parmveer, for joining us today and sharing this information. Excited to see the subgroup on our Connect extension platform. I just looked in there a moment ago and saw a number of really great resources that you all posted in there. So we'll get that information out to the registrants for the webinar along with a link to the recording. I understand that there's going to be a survey that you'd like to send out as well, so we'll include that and kindly ask our participants to take a moment when they receive that, if they don't mind taking a moment to fill out that survey for you all. That would be great. Any other closing thoughts that you have or comments?
Not for me, but just to thank everyone again for being here and for your questions. And great to speak with you here today.
All right. Well, thank you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks.